Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to talk about Leibniz's modal metaphysics. Now you are familiar with the term modality at this point from the discussions that we've had in this class. Modality concerns categories like possibility, necessity, actuality, and so on. And they're very, very important concepts for early modern philosophy. Leibniz describes his own argument in the Theodicy as an argument from the nature of possibility. So it's clear that modality is going to be very, very important for us to develop a systematic interpretation of Leibniz. And we can also explain where it is that he thinks the history of early modern metaphysics up to this point has gone wrong. The chief way that we're going to do that is by an examination of Leibniz's two predecessors, Descartes and Spinoza. If you were to raise a question to Descartes that we did not consider yet up to this point, which is something like, why are the eternal truths true, right? Why is it, for example, that the series of mathematical numbers are what they are? Why does 2 plus 2 equals 4? Why are what Descartes calls the innate truths or the eternal truths true? Descartes responds to this question in a way that is interesting but potentially reveals weaknesses about the nature of his philosophy. Descartes' answer is that the eternal truths, as we know and understand them, are innate ideas, and that they were stamped in our soul like a signet ring, right? They just belong to the nature of our soul, and God simply chose to put them there. It holds as a consequence of Descartes' view in exploration here that God, for example, could have chosen an alternatively different set of eternal truths. God could have made the series of natural numbers different than they were otherwise. So everything other than God, everything that depends on God's will, is in an important sense contingent, in the sense that they depend on the continuous will of God. So this results in ultimately Descartes' belief that everything in the world is contingent on God's will. Spinoza, interestingly, has basically the opposite position. As we've seen, he's criticized the notion of a free will, and he claims that God doesn't have a will in the sense that Descartes has supposed. Instead, all eternal truths follow necessarily from the essence of God on Spinoza's conception, right? And we investigated the way that Spinoza is a necessitarian, especially in his metaphysics of causation. So Spinoza has basically the opposite view of Descartes. Rather than holding that everything is contingent on the nature of God, instead, Spinoza is going to say that everything is necessary from God's essence, both historical events, but also a priori truths. Leibniz's view is an effort to set this tendency straight. For Leibniz, the error of Descartes and Spinoza is that they did not respect the distinction between what we have called up to this point a priori truths and a posteriori truths, or, contingent truths and necessary truths on Leibniz's account. Leibniz is not going to give a one-size-fits-all kind of modal theory. Instead, Leibniz is going to say that a priori truths are necessary and a posteriori truths are contingent. These are terms that we are going to have to investigate a little bit further. A priori truths describe all possible worlds. So Leibniz, for example, believes that 2 plus 2 equals 4 in any world that God could have chosen or endeavored to create. By contrast, a posteriori truths define the events of a particular world. So our world is characterized in part by the fact that World War II happened and the Allies were successful. And another possible world would be defined by the event where the Axis powers are successful, right? And so what makes our worlds different are the constellation of particular events within them. Worlds, therefore, are defined through compossibility, right? And the idea of compossibility is a completely novel, unique modal category that is very particular to Leibniz's philosophy. So we're going to spend the rest of the video unpacking this claim that worlds are defined through compossible events. But let's back up and explain how Leibniz understands all of these modal terms. For Leibniz, possibilities or possible events are events that do not violate the principle of non-contradiction. So it's possible, in principle, that I could fly or that I could jump 120 yards in the air, right? That doesn't describe this world, but there is a world where the conditions are such that I could realize that possibility. By contrast, actuality refers to events that are realized in the world. In other words, events that exist. So the version of me here that cannot jump 120 yards in the air, right? That penny exists. Whereas the penny that can jump, jumper penny, does not exist. The next category that modal accounts would normally discuss is necessity. But it's important for Leibniz that Leibniz thinks that there are two kinds of necessity that we often conflate. Namely, absolute necessity and hypothetical necessity. For Leibniz, absolute necessity are those truths that follow in all possible worlds. So the findings of mathematics and logic and metaphysics, these are going to be true in any world that God could have created. The existence of God is another absolute necessity for Leibniz. The contrast case is hypothetical necessity, truths that follow from particular circumstances. Now, with this framework in mind, we can really diagnose what was going on with Descartes and Spinoza from Leibniz's point of view. Spinoza made the error of saying that there was only absolute necessity, whereas Descartes made the mistake of saying that all necessity was hypothetical necessity, and they did not sufficiently or rigorously distinguish between these two. That provides us our last modal category, compossibility, or in other words, just possibility with. So compossible events are two events that can be actualized in the same world. So for example, we discussed actual penny and jumper penny as being two possibilities that are not possible within the same world. In other words, they are incompossible. By contrast, a world where I exist and a world where you're watching this video, these events can take place in the same world, right? We don't need to discuss merely possibility because you're here, you're listening, right? And I'm talking, and both of these events belong to the same causal network. So now we have a sense for what Leibniz meant whenever he said that worlds are defined by compossibility. Worlds are the totality of events that are compossible with one another. And therefore, worlds are causal nexuses, right? There are situations in which events take place, and events take place with one another. We're going to continue to develop this framework in the next video, where I'm going to talk in more detail about Leibniz and eternal truths. I very much look forward to hearing what you think, and I'll see you in the next video.